Welcome, everybody. In this time of the COVID pandemic still ravaging the world, laying bare stark inequalities and neglect of human rights, we come together in solidarity today for the inaugural Wollstonecraft Society Lecture to carry forth the flames of Mary Wollstonecraft. A late 18th century activist and intellectual, Mary Wollstonecraft was a pioneering fighter, not only for women's rights, demanding justice for one half of the human race, as she put it, but for human rights for all. I'm Alpa Shah, an associate professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics, and also convener of a research theme on the global economies of care at the International Inequalities Institute, the III. We are delighted at the III to be hosting this lecture in collaboration with the Wollstonecraft Society and the Newington Green Meeting House. Today's inaugural lecture will be given by Professor Amartya Sen, who has been one of the important forces reviving the legacy of Mary Wollstonecraft, long ago drawing attention to her as the most underestimated thinker of the Enlightenment. Amartya Sen is Thomas Lamont Professor, University Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University. But here at LSE, we very much consider him as part of our community. He was a professor of economics at LSE from 1971 to 1977, taught part-time from 1978 to 1982, and is now LSE Honorary Fellow. An Amartya Sen Chair in Inequality Studies was announced in 2019 to mark his legacy. Amartya Sen's research and writings have been world-changing. From his analysis of famine to his development of the capability approach, he has transformed economics, development studies, and beyond to center ideas of justice, freedom, and human rights. Amartya Sen's books have been translated into more than 30 languages, and his awards include the Nobel Prize in Economics. His memoir, Home in the World, will be published in July by Penguin, something that we all look forward to. Before handing over to Professor Sen, I will give the floor to B. Rowlatt, who is chair of the Wollstonecraft Society that is establishing this lecture series. B. Rowlatt is author of In Search of Mary, a book retracing Wollstonecraft's 1795 treasure hunt over the Skagerrak Sea. B. Rowlatt led the successful campaign for the Wollstonecraft Memorial Sculpture, whose fruits we can now all admire at Newington Green in Hackney, London. B will speak for just a few minutes before handing over to Professor Sen to present his lecture for half an hour. We will have some time for Q&A towards the end before we finish at 7:15. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, stating your name and affiliation. I will now hand over to B. Rowlatt. Thank you to everyone in the audience for coming, for being with us today. I hope this event will provide a platform for community building and education, optimism and hope in the spirit of Mary Wollstonecraft, and something that we all desperately need right now. Enjoy.
Thanks very much, Alpa, and thanks, LSE. I'm B. Rowlatt, and I'm one of the trustees of the Wollstonecraft Society. We're a new human rights education charity set up so that young people can discover Mary Wollstonecraft's astonishing life and her powerfully relevant work and be inspired by it. We've already enabled school visits, educational materials. This, for example, is the first ever Mary Wollstonecraft comic created by a local talented young artist. That's been delivered into over 200 state school libraries. This is all in conjunction with our wonderful friends at Newington Green Meeting House, who, by the way, have a week-long series of events themed around Mary Wollstonecraft's birthday, so do check that out. The Wollstonecraft Society was born out of the campaign for a memorial artwork for Wollstonecraft. You may remember that as the statue that wasn't a statue, the nudity furore that broke the internet and upset local, national and international press for over a week, at the end of which my mum very wisely remarked, well, you did want the whole world to know about her. which of course we do, and that's what's happening here today. Wollstonecraft's life was short but immense. Her work was foundational and it was prescient, and it goes on inspiring us today and beyond. And we've all heard children say, that's not fair. And, you know, we've all been that kid. What Mary Wollstonecraft teaches us is to scrutinize that impulse, to apply our critical faculties to it, to use our reason, a term she was so fond of. And if we don't do this, we're just another angry person shouting on the internet. In contrast, tonight, we are so lucky to have Amartya Sen giving this Wollstonecraft Society lecture. You all, of course, know his work on famine, on justice, on feminism. He was also a Wollstonecraft fan long before it was fashionable. The last time I saw you speak, Amartya, was in New Delhi, at the launch of your book, The Country of First Boys, and the huge hall filled up, the seats filled up, the corridors filled up, the doors filled up, then people started to scramble through the windows. Every inch was filled and everybody was hanging on his every word. That's how lucky we are to have Amartya Sen with us here right now. And with that, it's my great honor to hand over to you, Amartya.
Thank you so much. It's really a wonderful opportunity for me to join in the celebration of the beginning of the Wollstonecraft Society. As we mentioned, I have been a devotee of Wollstonecraft's thinking for a very long time, from my own student days, in fact. And this is a fantastic occasion and is being held in my favorite institution, namely the London School of Economics. I couldn't be happier. Mary Wollstonecraft's ideas were hugely important in the advancement of radical social thinking in the 18th century, a century that was also blessed with welcoming the highly original thoughts of David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Marquis de Condorcet, Edmund Burke, and Jeremy Bentham, among others. It's a very rich century, but I would say still that Mary Wollstonecraft is perhaps the most underestimated philosopher of the European Enlightenment, which stretches, of course, over the 18th century. Among Mary Wollstonecraft's path-breaking ideas, I would particularly be engaged today with her contributions to the discipline of human rights, including her early recognition of the conceptual importance of the perspective of these rights, and her focus on the relevance of this perspective as a powerful intellectual background for resisting established inequalities. The intellectual world has changed a great deal over the centuries, and some of the things that Mary had argued for are now easily recognized. And yet the need for an integrated intellectual foundation for the perspective of human rights is still very strong. We live in a world in which the idea of human rights is invoked in a great many different contexts. Democratic rights in protesting against authoritarian abuse, rights to personal liberty, in defending elementary autonomies in private life, civil rights in demanding basic political freedoms, economic rights against hunger and deprivation, health rights for medical care, particularly noticeable right now, gay and lesbian rights to safeguard freedom to pursue chosen lifestyles, and so on. The rhetoric of human rights is omnipresent in the contemporary world. However, Despite the tremendous appeal of the idea of human rights, it is also seen by many as being intellectually frail, lacking in foundation, and perhaps even in coherence and cogency. It's certainly true that the frequent use of the language of quote unquote rights of all human beings, very frequently used, which can be seen in many practical arguments and pronouncements, has not been adequately matched by critical scrutiny of the basis and congruity of the underlying concepts. This is partly because the invoking of human rights tends to come mostly from those who are more concerned with changing the world than with interpreting it, a distinction made famous by Karl Marx. There is stirring appeal on one side and deep conceptual skepticism on the other. Underlying that skepticism is the question, what exactly are human rights and why do we need them? Mary Wollstonecraft's contributions in answering these questions remain critically important even after 2.25 centuries. In her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, published in 1790, Mary Wollstonecraft told Edmund Burke, it's a kind of reply to Edmund Burke's essay on the American Revolution, that Burke, was much too greedy for, and I quote Wollstonecraft, instantaneous applause. You're seeking that all the time. As a result, you're not able to see things clearly. That was Mary's point. She invited Burke to reflect further. Their differences were clear enough since they took in many ways exactly opposite views in the two great revolutions of their time, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. At the risk of a slight oversimplification, it can be said that Edmund Burke supported the American Revolution, but not the French. Whereas Mary Wollstonecraft was thrilled with the French rising, but remained very doubtful about the thinking behind the American Revolution. Burke's critique of the French Revolution, with which we can begin, had come out in 1790 in his book called Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he made a powerfully conservative critique of what was happening in France. In fact, Burke's reflections on the French Revolution soon became, as the writer and playwright Stephen Greenblatt has put it, I quote, the most eloquent statement of British conservatism, favoring monarchy, aristocracy, property, hereditary succession, and the wisdom of the ages, unquote. So it became a kind of classic conservative text. Wollstonecraft, in contrast, wanted radical change. I don't think there was any bit of conservatism in her, and saw the French Revolution as great signs of hope. The difference between the two and the French Revolution is not hard to understand. But what about the American Revolution? What could have upset Mary Wollstonecraft, the quintessentially revolutionary English woman, about the American Revolution to make her skeptical of it? Why should a revolutionary woman be skeptical at all of a very important revolution, namely the American Revolution? How did she justify her lack of sympathy for the fight for independence of America from colonial British rule. Here is what Wollstonecraft said in criticizing Burke's support for American independence in her book, the first book I mentioned, A Vindication of the Rights of Men. So I'm now quoting Mary Wollstonecraft, criticizing Burke. On what principle Mr. Burke could defend American independence, I cannot conceive. For the whole tenor of his plausible argument settles slavery on an everlasting foundation, allowing his servile reverence for antiquity and prudent attention to self-interest to have the force which he insists on. The slave trade ought never to be abolished, and because our ignorant forefathers, not understanding the native dignity of man, sanctioned the traffic, that's slavery, that outrages every suggestion of reason and religion, we are to submit to the inhuman custom and turn an atrocious insult to humanity, that is slavery, the love of our country, and a proper submission to the laws by which our property is secured. Unquote. That's the end of the quotation from Mary. So Wollstonecraft's criticism of the American Revolution was not one for not wanting change, it's for wanting more change in America rather than less. She insisted that we cannot demand human rights for white Americans, but not for others. And it's not acceptable to keep some people enslaved while demanding self-governing freedom for others. Whether Wollstonecraft foresaw that slavery would in fact be outlawed in the British Empire well before this would happen in America, I'm not able to guess. But her argument surely was that it is not acceptable to demand freedom for some while keeping others in chains. Central to Wollstonecraft's focus was the urgent need for the human rights of slaves, which the American Revolution did not offer or even accept. So that's where her breaking of rank with the American Revolution lies. The perspective of human rights, rights that everyone is supposed to have, is particularly relevant in battling against inequality in human society. Slavery surely is a spectacular violation of human rights. The abolition of slavery would be only a beginning, but it would be a solid beginning of the vindication, to use Mary's own language, of the rights of women as well as men. And it could initiate an intellectual agenda for radical reorganization of society in the 18th century. Mary Wollstonecraft's own understanding of the need for clear articulation of the content of human rights evolved over the years. It actually did change a bit. When she wrote her first book on rights, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, in 1790, she took the term men to cover both women and men, as is often done. But by the time 2 years later, in 1792, Mary published a second book on rights, which is called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She had become very aware of the inequalities from which women suffered, and related to that, the overwhelming need for fighting for women's rights as a category on its own, and not just as a corollary of the rights of men standing for women as well. So there was a need for specifying the rights of women in particular, and that happened within these 2 years. Human rights have to be distinguished from legal rights, and following Wollstonecraft's reasoning, they can be seen, that is, human rights, as preceding, coming before legal rights. Indeed, they can be seen as motivation for legislation to establish certain legal rights for the benefit of all human beings. In this philosophical perspective, human rights are best seen as articulation of particular commitments in ethics, social ethics in particular, comparable to, but very different from, accepting utilitarian demands. You see, you don't compare the utilitarian demand with legal rights. Utilitarian demands are ethical claims, and what Wollstonecraft is saying, we have to replace the utilitarian demand with claims in ethics, and that's where human rights comes in. Like other ethical tenets, human rights can, of course, be disputed, but the claim is that they will survive open and informed scrutiny. Any universality that these claims have is dependent on the opportunity of unobstructed discussion, examination, and scrutiny. This view contrasts with seeing human rights in primarily legal terms, either as consequences of humane legislation or as precursors of legal rights. Human rights may well be reflected in legislation and may also inspire legislation. But this is a further fact, what a philosopher calls a further fact. It's true, but it's not a definitional characteristic. It's a further fact, something more. A further fact rather than a defining characteristic of human rights themselves. Many acts of legislation and legal convention, for example, like the powerful, I quote, the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedom, have clearly been inspired by a belief in some pre-existing rights of all human beings. In a classic essay called Are There Any Natural Rights, published in 1955, Herbert Hart, the outstanding legal philosopher from Oxford, argued that people, I quote, speak of their moral rights, mainly when advocating their incorporation in a legal system. So in that sense, it comes before the legal rights. This is certainly one way in which human rights has been invoked, and Hart's qualified defense of the idea and usefulness of human rights in this context has been justly influential. The Hartian approach is very much within Wollstonecraft's line of thinking. Wollstonecraft, however, went further. She didn't human rights only as inspiring legislation. She wanted more. The idea of human rights can be and actually is used in several other ways that go well beyond legislation. In many contexts, legislation is not at all involved. Indeed, many of the cases in which the idea of human rights is used, often to great effect, are not matters of legal rights at all, but what can be broadly called moral or ethical demands on each other, which influences our action. If a government is accused of violating some human rights, that accusation cannot really be answered simply by pointing out that there are no legally established rules in that country guaranteeing those legal rights. The case for fulfilling these rights, even in the absence of legislation, can be demanded on strongly moral grounds. And this is surely now one of the principal uses of human rights in the contemporary world. This applies particularly to human rights that relate to development, such as the right to food or to medicine or to some basic income. For example, in criticizing the present government of India's, criticizing the present government of India for its abject failure to provide the means of income, subsistence, and employment for people, including the poor. The moral and political force of the criticism can be strong for reasons that Mary Wollstonecraft had seen with great clarity, not because there is any legislation or even a proposal for legislation, but because it is politically and morally deeply important to have people with employment, income, and the basic facilities of living. Even when this failure arises from consequences of hurriedly chosen anti-pandemic policy, as not entirely, but to a great extent is the case in India, Wollstonecraft's argument remains critically important in demanding that the public policy currently in force be amended to protect people's important human rights. That, of course, is a major debate going on in India right now. And it's really on Wollstonecraftian lines. The relation between human rights and legal rights is in fact a subject also with some considerable history. The American Declaration of Independence in 1776 took it to be, I quote, self-evident that everyone is, quote, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And 13 years later, in 1789, the French Declaration of the Rights of Men asserted that, quote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. By the way, using the word men here to cover women too, in terms of the 1790 use of Wollstonecraft rather than the 1792 distinction. These are clearly free legal terms to be reflected in law, not originating in law, and as such, they belong to the same category as human rights. It did not, however, take Jeremy Bentham long, who was very opposed to the idea of human rights, in his book called Anarchical Fallacies, written at the same time during 1791-92, aimed specifically against the French idea of human rights, to propose the total dismissal of all such claims precisely because they are not legally based. That he won't accept the claim for anything to be a right without legality behind it. Bentham insisted that, I quote, natural rights is simple nonsense, and natural and imprescriptible rights, and Bentham described it as an American phrase, rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. I'm not quite sure what nonsense upon stilts might mean, but is, I take it, some kind of a artificially elevated nonsense. Bentham went on to explain, I quote from Bentham, right, the substantive right, is the child of law. From real laws come real rights, but from imaginary laws, from laws of nature, can come only imaginary rights. It's easy to see that Bentham's rejection of the idea of natural rights of man depends entirely on his insistence on a privileged use of the term right, seeing it in specifically legal terms and in no other. However, insofar as human rights are meant to be significant ethical claims, as Mary Wollstonecraft pointed out, pointing to what we owe to each other and what claims we must take seriously, as Mary Wollstonecraft discussed, the diagnosis that these claims do not necessarily have legal force, at least not yet, is in fact quite irrelevant. These human rights were not, as with Bentham, children of law, but in fact can be seen as parents of law, providing grounds for legislation, a point of view that would receive support from the legal philosophy of Herbert Hart, whom I quoted earlier. Mary Wollstonecraft discussed elaborately how women's legitimate entitlement could be promoted by a variety of processes, of which legislation was only one, and need not even be always the principal one. The effectiveness of these moral claims, their practical vindication, in addition to their ethical acceptance, would depend on a variety of social features, such as actual educational arrangement, public campaign for behavioral modification, for example, modifying what we would now call sexist behavior, and so on. The subject, I dare say, is increasingly better understood in public discussions today than it was at the time when Bentham was quarreling with Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft would not have been in the least surprised that many social movements, including the work of NGOs such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, and others, have been so effective in helping to protect and advance human rights in economic, social, political, medical, and other fields through channels quite other than legislation. Wollstonecraft's approach received strong support from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was made in 1948, particularly led by Eleanor Roosevelt, which paved the way for many constructive global activities. That declaration did not give the recognized human rights any legal status, but the effectiveness of the recognition as human rights has come in many other ways. The ways include fresh legislation with an agreed recognition, which an agreed recognition can inspire, but not just that, but also other efforts that are supported and bolstered by the recognition of some foundational claims as globally acknowledged human rights. Also, global NGOs like Amnesty, Oxfam, and so on have been involved for a long time in advancing human rights to actual programs in providing food or medicine or shelter, or by helping to develop economic and social opportunities. Yeah. Um, and also through public discussion and advocacy, and through publicizing and criticizing violation of these required behavior. I move now to a final question. If human rights are not vindicated by legislation, rather legislation may draw on them, what criteria can we use for the ethical vindication of these claims? Mary Wollstonecraft clearly accepted that, like other claims that are subjected to public reasoning, the robustness of human rights relates to the strength of reasoning, in particular on their survivability in unobstructed discussion. Kind of point that, as philosophers in the audience would know, has been much discussed, particularly recently by people like Derek Farfet, Tim Scanlon, Tom Nagel, and others. The fact that invoking of the idea of human rights has such social and political effectiveness is itself some evidence in the direction of the durability and reach of these claims. But it is possible, further, to have substantive arguments on what priorities we should place on different claims that all have widespread appeal, but differ in their importance for human freedom. To subject the claims of human rights to public scrutiny is a part of the discipline of human rights, is not a sign of any weakness. Indeed, the connection between public reasoning and the formulation and use of human rights is extremely important to understand. Any general plausibility that the ethical force of human rights has is on this theory dependent on their survival and flourishing when they encounter unobstructed discussion and scrutiny, along with adequately wide informational availability. So I end by emphasizing that Mary Wollstonecraft's far-reaching approach to human rights is a very powerful example of the use of reason-based ethics. Her perspective had the promise of vastly extending the reach of social thinking, from which the world has greatly benefited. We have reason to be grateful to this 18th century radical thinker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. That was absolutely fantastic. Also just so vastly, I mean, hugely important to revive the idea of human rights as being separate from legislation and something that we all need to reclaim and reason with. And in a time where authoritarian governments are ruling the world and where we can see how human rights issues have to be separated from the law in order to reclaim what the state can do for the people. It's just so important to have this lecture today, right now.
Thank you.
So thank you, very much appreciated. There are a number of questions that have already been raised in the Q&A, and if you don't mind, I'm going to turn to a few of them now. I'm aware that you've just given this huge lecture and it's an exhausting task, but if you can bear with me, I will take a few of the questions. Yeah. There's one of the questions that has been raised, I guess it in some ways has been answered by how your lecture developed, but it came from Dipanshu Mohan, an LSE alumni. And he's asking to what extent is an inflation of rights-based discourse legislating for change, actually leading to a dilution of key ethical, normative, moral claims that are essential to safeguarding of and advocacy for human rights. So especially in this context where extremism, authoritarianism has risen. So, you drew attention in your lecture to Amnesty International, Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, and all the important work that they're doing. I guess the question is really asking what can be learned from the life and thought of Wollstonecraft to reimagine the discourse and practice of human rights advocacy for a better future. I mean, where should all of these organizations, what kind of advocacy should human rights advocacy be taking for a better future?
Yeah.
That's quite a big question, so perhaps I will give that over to you.
Yeah, well, I think these are big questions, certainly, but I think one of the things that that Mary Wollstonecraft taught us is that you shouldn't be afraid of raising gigantic questions, even if it looks that nobody else is uh, raising them right now. When she raised this question, well, our first book, dismissing the American Revolution's claim to be just on grounds that it admitted slavery. Nowhere did it ban slavery. That's, of course, a very powerful argument. You cannot demand rights for some, but not for others. And then when she came to the women thing, she went on discussing as to how, giving good examples of how women are neglected. And one of the interesting things there is that she's liberating herself from just formal rights. And instead, she's saying many things happening in the society will influence women's rights, human rights. For example, education. For example, voice in public discussion. She comes close even to discussing journalism, whether women can express their point of view. And if you look at these institutions, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, one time or other, I've been involved with all of them, but they all take on this very broad perspective. So I think, I'm not sure what Mohan's real worry is. If it is that having so many different things may dilute their force, I don't agree with that. I tend to take the Wollstonecraft point of view that you have to simultaneously approach them. One of these, I strongly recommend you reading the second book, 1792 book, where she ends by addressing a French legislator after the revolution, and she's saying, look, I'm saying these things, and I would like you to examine my argument, not just from the examples, but from its principle, and compare it with the principle that neglects women. And if after that examination you come round to the view then that women's perspectives deserve a bigger attention, then I would request you to take it up with the French Assembly to incorporate that change. So you see, at one side, she's very practical, not letting it go. Of course, the reign of terror is still to come, and that wouldn't be a very good period. But she was still hoping that something can be done by reasoning. So she had this great faith in reasoning, great faith in facts and examples, but also great courage in taking on many questions and arguing that you have to approach these questions simultaneously. It's not good enough to think of law. You have to think about schooling, newspapers, and what is conventional for people to talk about when they meet.
Thank you, thank you. All power to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and all the wonderful work that they're doing right now, right? I have another question from Apala Mandal, who is a student at Delhi University. And this is a question that I think often comes up when I speak to students too. And it's about the individualization of rights that are based in notions of human rights. So she says, and I'll just tell you exactly what she says because it's very articulately put together. According to Mahmoud Mamdani, the issue of invoking the language of human rights to address violations turns structural discrimination into individualizable crimes. While this helps visualize and address violations, Mamdani's claim is it divorces occurrences from the circumstances that birthed them, right? The structural circumstances. In this context of the violations I see in my nation today, she's talking about India, this pattern seems to be recreated. Do you think that this is an inherent flaw of a human rights paradigm vindicated by legislation?
I'm not sure I fully understood it. I greatly respect Mamdani, who's also a personal friend. But what is he saying? Where are we making the mistake?
So as I understand it, I mean, I wish Apala could speak up right now,
Speak
but
here? No, she is not here.
I am not
You may
sure.
not be able to find her.
Yeah,
You
we
may
can't
not be
have.
able to find. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'd have to just imagine what she's saying, but it's about the tension that exists between a kind of structural notion of human rights, you know, holding structures to account and structural circumstances to account, whereas a lot of rights-based legislation is based on the idea of an individual, so holding individuals to account. So do you think that there is an inherent flaw in the human rights paradigm, which is based on
I think
notion of rights? Yeah.
no. I think this is a very interesting question. I think it was best addressed by Karl Marx, actually, in the book called um, uh, the book on German ethics, really, and he's discussing that the problem here arises not from looking at the individual, but not understanding that individual is a social creature. So you cannot divorce the individual from the structure under which the individual moves. Yeah. In fact, in my first book, Collective Choice and Social Welfare, I quote that sentence of Marx in the first page to indicate it's not, don't ask the question, why only the individual? Why only the individual is a big question. The individual is a very big thing. The individual lives in a society, has been reared by parents, has gone to school, had argued with friends, had quarreled with them, and had belonged to political groups or literary or social interactions. And that's what the individual is. So what we are seeing as social features are part of the making up of the individuals. And after all, when we born or die, we may die alone and we may be born alone. But that doesn't make us alone through our life, because what we do is uh, is, is to be integrated with the world around us. And that's what the book German Ideology is really, well, there are many different points, but that's a strikingly important point. I have a book coming out, by the way, called, called uh, um, uh, it's a movement from Tagore. It's about our role in home in the world, it's called. And I discussed there how this Marxian idea actually relates. I'm not a Marxist, by the way. There are quite a lot of Marxist ideas, I think. I don't know that's important too. But there's some real gems, and this is one of the gems.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think the whole premise of your lecture is that we've got to look beyond legislation to a big kind of moral, ethical idea of human rights.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. So we move away from, legislating against what an individual says to a wider idea. So thank you for the answer. There's some really fantastic questions out there. Another really great question is from Samuel, who is a PPE student at the Open University in UK. And he says that he finds it fascinating that Mary Wollstonecraft opposed the American Revolution while it was supported, if not instigated, by Thomas Paine, and both were arguing on the grounds of rights. So what is the key difference in each of their stances? Are you able to elaborate on that?
This is a very exciting and interesting question. And as a fellow alumnus of Open University, since I had an honorary degree from there, I'm delighted that question is coming from the Open University. I think what happened is that the American Revolution was a thrilling moment. Did it not thrill Mary Wollstonecraft? I bet it did. But Wollstonecraft was hopping mad, if I may use that expression, about the American Revolution did not address slavery. Like many others in Britain, including, as it happened, the leading economist of their time, namely Adam Smith, who was great opponent of slavery. Similarly, Marquis Condorcet, great opponent of slavery and supporter of the American Revolution and the French. But they hoped very much that the American Revolution would address the issue of slavery, but it didn't. And what, and now you mentioned, which other supporter did you mention? You mentioned somebody's name other than Wollstonecraft.
You just mentioned Thomas Paine.
Tom Paine. Now, Tom Paine. See, Tom Paine took a different line. Namely, he was using the red pen over the American Declaration of Independence. And he wanted to change it in certain ways. And he thought that ideally they should have been different. And proceeded to discuss what its implications would be. And in fact, Garth Stedman Jones, in his book on poverty in America, says that the alterations that Tom Paine was suggesting, dealing with the understanding of poverty, actually had a major influence on poverty legislation in America. And similarly, he would have wanted the slavery, he was anti-slavery, he would have wanted that to be changed. So Tom Paine, was in favor of the American Revolution, which in an odd way, Mary Wollstonecraft was too. They both found certain features of them unacceptable. Mary Wollstonecraft just made a very strong denunciation, and it sounded fantastic. The most revolutionary English woman of her time saying, "How could you support American Revolution?" I mean, it's really almost from a play. But what she is trying to say, for God's sake, stand up and address slavery. And what Tom Paine was that, here I am addressing slavery. Read me, please, read me. So there wasn't then a real different between them, and also what I said about human rights. Not every bit of it, but quite a bit of it. Tom Paine would have also gone with Wollstonecraft almost all the way. Wollstonecraft was um, more focused on certain things than Tom Paine was. Tom Paine was a general anti-poverty philosopher, really.
Thank you. We have a question from Lee Edwards, who is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications here at the LSE. And he says, he asks, what challenges do you see for the maintenance and development of human rights in this digital age, given the limits of an increasingly commercialized and politicized online world, and what, the obstructions it puts to discussion? So yeah, it's a very relevant question from Lee Edwards to you.
It's very relevant indeed from Lee. I think we have to distinguish between the way in which modernity aids human rights and the way it makes it more challenging and difficult. I think the informational spread is a very positive feature of this. When something, consider the case, for example, when the Taliban captured the Fort Valley in Pakistan, and there were cases of young girls being penalized for bad behavior, and Taliban actually, I forgot whether they whipped her or caned or something. And there was dislike of that in Pakistan, but people did not rise to do anything very much about it. Just regarded that to be a very bad thing happening. But then one of the persons connected actually, but not a member of Pakistan Human Rights Commission, a friend of ours, Jahangir and I, Rahman, who recently died, took huge risk and went there with a camera shaped like a telephone. So he can be seen throughout the whipping scene of the girl using the telephone. In fact, he was taking a video. And then it was put on the Pakistan main channels as what's happening in the Fort Valley, so that the Pakistani population not only knew that about it, but actually saw, including the pain of the girl. And the policy became unviable. The Pakistan army, which had not earlier going to intervene, now was forced to intervene. There was so much public demand. Now this is a positive fruit of modernity, making video a help in the human rights thing. But then there will be other when I cannot keep my privacy, when things get moved away from me, or quite often happens. There are financial transactions that take place, which sanctions one is going on in both in India and Pakistan right now a lot, which takes away power from ordinary people to others. Well, that's a negative thing. So I think Lee is very right to emphasize that there are problems, there are benefits too, and sometimes the beneficial channels can be used for dealing with the problem too. That's where the skill of political action really is. So we're entering into a territory of great excitement, and I hope Lee would continue to think about these problems and propose ways and means of how to relate them.
Oh, I'd love to be as hopeful as you, Professor Sen, but with the great internet shutdowns that we have, in Kashmir and in India, I mean, it's such a bleak picture too, what the digital age can do for human rights. And in relation to
Yeah,
that,
but the digital age could have done that. Sorry, even in the absence of digital age, those nasty policies could well have been implemented. I think the digital age generates a possibility of addressing that issue. It hasn't been addressed now, and I might be put in jail for suggesting that people look into ways and means of doing that. But, it's a free country, it's a democratic country. There's no particular reason why people shouldn't use every means that are available to
yes,
pursue what we think is morally right. That is, in many ways, of course, the main lesson of Mary Wollstonecraft. You cannot get away from moral examination of everything. Neither the American Declaration of Independence nor the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, uh, all of them are open for scrutiny, examination, critique.
yeah. Thank you for that. Talking about India, I have two questions on India and China from two separate people. Monica Gogoi, who is a student at Presidency University in India, she's asking about the present condition of India and what structural changes in public policy would you recommend to protect human rights in India at present? And then I have a question from Susan Rifkin, who's a former lecturer at the LSE, who's asking, how do you apply your analysis to the Chinese approach to human rights? And I thought it'd be nice to maybe think about these two questions together.
Well, the Chinese approach to human rights is a much more complicated issue because of as we know from, particularly from the Hong Kong example, that there are many layers of control and thinking that come into it. And I don't think we have at all the time to go into the Chinese question. That's really difficult. On the Indian side, I mean, India did begin with this great deal of respect for human rights. If you look at all the discussion in the Constituent Assembly, that went on the subject of human rights quite a lot. They didn't use the word, but it was very much present. But I think there were, I would say, two basic faults which I think was underestimated. One is that you could divide the role of um, executive, legislature, and judiciary. You can. However, the executive has an advantage if it is uh, able to affect things like how are judges remunerated? Do they receive any kind of um, support or benefit when they retire, and so on? Now, I'm not saying the judges are all affected by it. Many of them are not. There are cases of wonderful judgments that have come even very recently. But the executives have an ability to do things which judiciary and legislature cannot. Secondly, if on top of the executives, and maybe with the help of the executives, including the use of money, if you manage to capture the legislature, then it can produce a dramatic deflection from the demands of democracy in a way that could be very difficult to resist, because you get the legislature going on providing some kind of support, executives carrying it out in some other kind of way, and then making sure that the two together produce a system which is very difficult to resist. So I think we have to do two things. This is to Monica, and she comes from the college where I was myself educated. So Monica, there are two things here. We have to examine, and this is difficult thought, as to in what way do we should um, see the Constitution needing a further examination, and the only establishment that can do it, of course, is the judiciary. But secondly, a lot of the Constitution is being violated in serious ways. For example, I would say the uh, not to have moved the habeas corpus uh, over a long stretch of time is a violation of the spirit of the Constitution. I would say also that there are a number of penalties that people have, including the British used to call it, I'm trying to think what the Indian name is, that is keeping people in jail, not on grounds that they have done anything, but on grounds that they might. When I was in school, all my uncles were in jail, not because they had done anything, but the British thought, this was British India, that they might. So they were um, treated as having committed this crime, not because they had, but they could. And I thought that when India became independent, that would be abolished. Well, the Congress dragged its feet in reform it, like in many other things. They should have done much more. But then, after the regime changed to the present regime, you found a much greater, much more vigorous execution of things that are basically not in the spirit of the Constitution. So I think we need both constitutional thinking and also constitutional application in dealing with these things. I mean, India is a democratic country. It has that structure, and there's no reason why we shouldn't claim the fruits of that.
Thank you for that hopeful note on India. We will shortly run out of time, but there are really some really fantastic questions out there. And maybe I will end with two, and then you can decide how you would like to end it. And I'd also like to invite Bea if she'd like to add anything at the end.
Yes, please.
And so the two I've picked are one which has troubled me. Earlier today, I was on the phone to a friend saying, that I was chairing this lecture and so excited about it. And she said, yeah, I'm just reading about Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, and the domestic servants they had, and raising the issues of the internal contradictions that we all have, I guess. And the question is from Eileen Hunt, who is at the University of Notre Dame in political science, and she's basically asking about Wollstonecraft supporting the French Revolution, which also failed to abolish slavery initially and failed to support mulatto rights, leading to the Haitian Revolution in 1791. She's at the one hand supporting the French Revolution, but on the other hand, we've got the treatment of what's happening in Haiti. Another interesting fact is her brother Charles went to America and owned slaves in New Orleans. While Wollstonecraft did not stay in touch with him once when he went to America, she helped him get there. How do we make sense? I mean, she's asking this question question about how do we make sense of these real or potential ideological contradictions as scholars of Wollstonecraft's political philosophy or human rights and the injustice of slavery. And I guess this is a general question about the contradictions, that in progressive thinking and in our actions, that in radical thought more generally. That's one question. And the other is a kind of more hopeful one, which is from Simon Cole, who is an alternative tour guide in Hackney in East London. And he's asking, outside of the universities, where are the Wollstonecrafts? Where are the Arendts today? How do you see, what do you see happening?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
But from Simon Cole, he's basically asking, this is a month where we've got, such bleak month. We've refused to share vaccine patents. We've condemned vast numbers of people to death. Where is the public debate outside universities on the ethics of state policy? Where are the Wollstonecrafts Arendts of today? Where
is a rhetorical question? It isn't.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Simon is saying, why not? I mean, he can start it as much as I can. So I think, and maybe at the age of 87, I'm less able to start it than he is. No, I mean, that is a big question, obviously, because if you contrast, for example, compare the food shortage during the Second World War, that led to rationing, and the rationing had the effect of eliminating undernourishment, severe undernourishment altogether. And so one contrary effect was that just when Britain was suffering from huge shortage of food, undernourishment entirely disappeared. In the year before the rationing, decade before the rationing, British life expectancy went up by 1.5 years. But in the year of the rationing, it went up by 7 years. That was an enormously positive result, very dialectical happening in response. Had it happened in terms of the medical care and sharing, no, I did write, by the way, an article in the Financial Times exactly discussing this issue. I'll have to refer that to Simon, I think. And no, these are problems that have arisen, and we have to talk about them and hopefully arrive at somewhere on that. On the first, the difficulty with I don't know of the particular events mentioned. Did Mary treat her servants particularly badly? I know that somebody, an Oxford historian, had claimed that in an article that I read a long time ago. I don't know whether that's true or not. And I can't be difficulty in dealing with questions in a meeting is that somebody informs you of something which you have no way of checking, and then you have to respond assuming it to be true. I just don't know. And what happened to Wollstonecraft's brother? I ought to read about the brother, but I can't read it now and answer the question. So I think that in terms of fairness of question mongering, if I may use the word, one has to see what could be legitimately expected to be discussed in a situation without a radical change in the informational structure. The servants issue is a big one, by the way, and I wish that I've forgotten the name of the person who raised that. that should be taken up, because quite often people are comfortable with having servants of their own, and yet they're very egalitarian in some other respect. Given the contradictions that make up human beings, there's nothing astonishing about it. On the other hand, is it a good thing? No. And can something be discussed on that? Yes. Have books been written on the subject? Yes. Two from Bangladesh I can refer to straight away, dealing exactly with that question. So it depends. And also there's a question of context sometimes. There's a claim that when the Russian, the Communist Party was trying to achieve a deal with the Germans at the time of the First World War, in order to pave the way with the French Revolution. Sorry, it was Russian Revolution. It's thought Trotsky, I don't believe it's correct at all, but it's a story that's told by actually no less than Nehru in his book, that he wrote to Lenin saying that I've been invited to a party where I could discuss this issue very well, which is such an important issue, but they're insisting that I should come in tuxedos, and that goes against the principle of the party. What do you think? You wrote that to Lenin, and Lenin is supposed to have replied saying, if it would help you to strike a deal, go in a petticoat. And so, so it was just changing, just distinguishing between context, and depending on the context, you may have to do things which are not so good. But the issue of servants, or issue of how you're better to each others, how they think about slavery, are not trivial at all. They are really big issues. But we have to distinguish between distinct things that are coming into a story. And to get a kind of comprehensive thing, get a woman like Mary Wollstonecraft, who got all the right ideas, who gives all the right example, who provides all the strong argument, who has no bad relation with his wife or husband or children or servant or with anyone else that he encounters on the street, who none of whose relations go away to another country and behave badly. It is an easy picture to construct. So if revolution required that, it may be very hard to have revolution. But on the other hand, these questions are important.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. We've run well over time, and you've graced us with your presence and your intellect and your brilliant political ideas, which are so important right now. So we're so grateful for you for having given this lecture and been around for the discussion. And I'm sorry to the audience for those who have not been able to have their questions raised. So many amazing questions, but we have a huge audience out there and huge numbers of questions coming in. But I would like to give the floor to Bea just for a minute or two, if she's got some final thoughts that she'd like to add before we close today's lecture.
I just had a very brief answer to the last question from Simon, who asked, where are the Wollstonecrafts now? It's the work of the Wollstonecraft Society to enable and support and generate future Wollstonecrafts. So please support us, go to the website, and you can sign up for our quarterly newsletter. And thank you very much for tuning in to listen to this lecture.
Thank you, Bea. And it's such a pleasure for us at the LSE to host this lecture with you and with the Newington Green Meeting House. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Amartya Sen.
Yeah, and thanks to you for arranging all this.
All the best. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.